just want to make sure you're good, and then I'll leave you.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this Q&A session. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm just going to turn off. There we go. It is such a treat to be here, and I hope you can still hear me okay. We're just going to do a little sound check to make sure everything is just fine. Oh, and I see the questions are coming through right now. And Carolyn, yes, you are correct. I am reaching you from France right now. I'm in the south of France on a holiday, but you know what? I don't take a holiday from baking. I am actually intensely researching French butter by tasting all of the French butter I possibly can. And I have to say, I haven't found one I don't like. But I am actually here for you today. And it's great to see so many familiar names. And I want to ask your questions, answer your questions. You're going to ask the questions. So I'm going to follow the thread and we'll just hang out for the next little while, taking your questions. And I see already we've had a discussion about American flour versus Canadian flour, because you may have noticed that when I include my weight measurements for flour, they're based on Canadian flour, which I find is the equivalent to UK or European flour, but American flour by volume weighs a little bit less. So where a cup of Canadian flour is 150 grams, to be precise, it's 147 grams. But I rounded up and always test my recipes to verify it works well. But I find when it comes to American flour, 125 grams is about the average for one cup. And it just behaves differently. So you have to follow your own flour's weight equivalency. And I hope that helps sort of address that question. I do believe that cake and pastry flour are a little more similar, but still the weight comes out a bit different. And Hermione, hello from Greece, and Italy was absolutely delicious. So I've been doing a bit of a tour. Hello from Turkey. I was also in Istanbul for 4 days, which was absolutely delicious. Oh, and we've got the questions rolling in. SFMBK is asking, today I made a chocolate icing, but it was very gritty. Can I turn it into a cake? You could try. You would have to really soften that frosting. I don't know what kind of frosting it is. If it is an American buttercream, just butter and icing sugar, that's a good starting point. You would want to add eggs to it, and then add your flour and likely some milk alternating to work with that as a base. But it's worth giving it a try as opposed to simply just throwing it out and starting again. Now, oh, we've got hellos from everywhere. And Vanessa, you are asking for vegan pastry recipes. I do have quite a few out there. And I know someone was asking earlier about eggless recipes. So let's touch on baking without dairy ingredients and baking without egg ingredients for a quick second while more questions roll in. From Vancouver, from England, I see you from Mexico and the Philippines. It's absolutely amazing. So when it comes to non-dairy fat, you're looking at coconut oil. Virgin coconut oil is kind of your better all-natural single ingredient butter replacement. The thing to remember is coconut oil is, number one, it's 100% fat, where butter is 80% fat in Canada. It's 84% butter fat here in France. So you have to reduce your coconut oil by 15% and increase your liquid by that 15% volume to really make it behave like butter in your baking, because you might find actually things are too heavy or too greasy. There are non-dairy butter substitutes. Some are very good. Some you have to be wary of because they can have a high salt content. So I always recommend if you're going to try those, leave the salt out of your recipe until you find out how the flavor balances out. In terms of dairy to replace milk, I really love using oat milk. I love its texture and its consistency. And then I opt for almond milk as a very close second. And then you get into your soy and rice milk, which don't behave as well in baking. And in terms of cream, coconut cream, it really is a fantastic option. And that is where you chill your tin. If you buy your coconut milk in a tin, chill the tin, don't stir it. And then that thick fat that rises to the top, that's your cream base. You can whip it up, save some of your coconut liquid at the bottom in case it's actually too thick. And then that can replace whipping cream in the recipe. Now, talking about eggless baking, you want to look at silken tofu to replace eggs where you want a smooth consistency. So like anything custard base, even if it's a faux custard without using milk, you would want to use silken tofu, and you would use 60 grams of silken tofu for every single egg. And then, of course, you've got your flax egg for simple things like muffins, cookies, and that is a tablespoon of ground flaxseed for 3 tablespoons of tepid water. Stir it, let it sit for a minute, poof, and that replaces an egg. So I hope that gives you some of the basics. Here's a question about why puff pastry. We give it a limited shelf life in the fridge, even though it's made mostly of butter, and nor does it have any leavening ingredients. It's a very good question. And most storage tips, my storage parameters, whether it be a cake, a tart, or unbaked pastry, is based on what is compromised when the item sits for longer. And when it comes to a pie dough or a puff pastry, it's more about the fridge taste and the moisture content that changes. So in the refrigerator, your puff pastry and your pie dough continues to dry out. The refrigerator is a dehydrator. And so that's why I give it a 4-day shelf life. And your other option, though, of course, is freezing it, in which case you can freeze it for months and months and months. So I hope that gives you sort of a good guiding tip. That same dehydrating effect of the fridge also applies to cakes, which is why a frosted cake whole will keep for a few days. The minute you cut it, the circulating air of the fridge will start drying out that cake, and that's why the shelf life gets reduced. Oh, here are some questions going in. We've got, how do we make chocolate ganache? And is it possible to make any cake by steaming? So the first question, to make your basic chocolate ganache, and you'll find lots of ganache recipes and ganache-based recipes right here on my channel. But your basic ganache recipe is a 1-to-1 ratio of whipping cream to chocolate, and that is couverture or baking chocolate. So for 250 grams of chocolate, you heat up 250 ml of whipping cream, pour it on the chocolate, let it sit for a minute, and then the key is to stir gently. So you don't over agitate the chocolate, and that keeps it nice and smooth. The minute you start adding butter to it, it becomes thicker, and that becomes more of a truffle for a bonbon filling or a tart. Or you add your eggs to it, and then you make a tarte au chocolat with it. And then the other question that was just asked was, can you just take a basic baked cake and steam it? And the answer is almost, but not quite. What I find when I steam cakes, because you're adding so much moisture through the steaming process, 2 things I do when I look at a recipe is I reduce the sugar, because the sugar liquefies and it can make a cake really sticky when you steam it. And I also reduce the fat. So I reduce the sugar by about half, and I reduce the fat by about 1/3. And I find then that moisture from steaming can replace that. Sponge cakes are a little trickier. You have to give yourselves a little more time, but they do work quite well. I think you'll find right here on the channel, I have a recipe for a steamed carrot cake that is very, very delicious. So I hope you give it a try. And these questions are coming in like crazy. It's great to see everyone writing. Here I can tell we've got bakers who use my recipes. A question as to a maple syrup replacement in my chiffon cake recipe. That's where I would go for, if you're going to use honey as a replacement. Reduce the amount by a third. So you're using 2/3 the amount of maple syrup, and you won't have to reduce it as much because it's already thick. And that should work absolutely fine, because whether it's maple syrup, honey, or even granulated sugar, that will lend structure and stability to your whipped egg cakes, like a chiffon cake. So we've covered off that question. Oh, and here, Ilianne, great question. Does letting the batter sit while I bake change the results? And so that's a good question, because if you have a small oven, then you might be wondering, well, I have to bake my cakes, or I only have one round cake pan, but I have enough batter for 3 cake layers. Can my batter sit in my mixing bowl for up to an hour to 2 hours? For most cakes that are leavened with baking powder or baking soda, you'll be absolutely fine. Don't put them in the fridge, because then you'll set the butter, and then your bake time and your consistency of your cake will come out differently. In terms of a sponge cake, that's where you want to, as soon as you finish folding your batter, you do want to get that cake in the oven. But, most sponge cake recipes don't often call for multiple pans. So I hope that answers your questions. Marilyn, I don't have plans for a ready-made cake mix yet, though I am looking into getting into the market of some consumable items, finding good quality chocolate, vanilla, spices that I can put out there, knowing that I've tested them. So that's what I'm actually having fun playing with now. And actually being here in the south of France, I'm getting a lot of interesting ideas for products that are well made here with minimal packaging. It's really, really exciting. Oh, and here's another great question. Can I, it just disappeared. It was about brown sugar and molasses. You can, if you don't have brown sugar, you can create brown sugar by adding, for every 200 grams or 1 cup of granulated sugar, remove 1 tablespoon or 15 ml and replace that with 1 tablespoon of molasses. That will give you the moisture you need in your brown sugar. Oh, and Margarita from Colombia is asking about reducing your sugar in your cake recipes. Now, this can take a little bit of playing, Margarita. You want to look carefully at your recipe, because sugar lends more than sweetness to a cake. It lends structure. So typically, if you want to reduce your sugar, don't do it for a sponge cake, but you can do it for a cake where you cream butter and sugar together, add your egg and your dry ingredients. What you will want to do, though, additionally, is increase your liquid. So if you're reducing your sugar by 25%, don't increase your liquid by a full 25%. Start with 15%, and that will help as your ingredients bake, because different things melt at different times in the oven. It will help your batter come together better. Oh, Bilal, here's a question. Can I totally use gluten-free all-purpose flour in Financier? Yes, because the nice thing about Financier is they're dense, heavy, moist cakes. Almond flour takes up a lot of space, and if the recipe calls for an all-purpose flour, it's usually not so much. So using a gluten-free substitute should work just fine. Oh, Ghazi, I love your suggestion of using mashed dates instead of sugar in cookies. Now, if your reason for cutting down on sugar is for diabetic reasons, you do have to be careful, because dates, while still a natural sugar, are a sugar, and that can spike your insulin. You have to keep an eye on that. So depending on your reasoning, if you're looking for a more natural option, dates offer a fantastic option. Oh, and we have a question from England about my ovens. I have 2 ovens that I bake with at home. One that is a still oven and it's gas, and I have another oven that's convection and is electric. So it means when I'm developing recipes, I can test using both ovens to verify. But something to keep in mind is that when you see instructions for anything baked, I can speak for my recipes definitely, but most baking recipes in general assume a temperature based on a still oven. So an oven with no fan. And that's because that is a consistent base point. Different ovens have different fan speeds, and with a different fan speed comes a different heat and air circulation, which can change the way things bake. So at least we all know a 350 still oven will achieve the temperature that and the time that you see specified in the recipe. Um, oh, Neetu from India is asking about chocolate chip cookies, which is better, baking powder or baking soda? Now, that's a very good question. If you like chewy cookies, then you want to use baking soda. If you like crispy cookies, interestingly, replacing the baking soda with baking powder will make them crisp up a little bit more. And in terms of the baking temperature, it can really depend. I find if I'm baking my cookies from the fridge, I will let my oven heat up to about 375. If I'm baking them from room temperature, I let them go at 350 because they don't need that additional time for the butter to melt. I hope that answers your question. Melissa is asking, she needs some help emoji. Hello from Texas. You want your cookies to be perfectly round. And well, good for you for using a glass, or you can use a cookie cutter to sort of spin around the cookies coming from the oven. Are you using an ice cream scoop, a portion scoop? And if so, you want to scoop, if it's a soft batter, and drop straight down from the scoop onto your baking tray to really coax that shape. On an angle, it can actually elongate the cookie. You end up with more of an oval. The other tip is to scoop and then chill your batter first. So that way that round shape is set in place a little bit more. That's a great question. I love that these questions are flying in and flying in from everywhere. I see it. Someone else from Texas, someone from Algiers is writing. Oh, here we go. Samina, an eclair question. Your eclairs are puffing up and then they're deflating. So your oven just may require, your eclairs may require just a little more bake time to really make sure that shell is set before you open the oven door to let them air out and dry out. Because you want that combination. You want the volume and the lift, and you want that to be set, but then you need to also let your eclairs or profiteroles, if you're making them, dry out so that they have space to fill and they stay crispy. So I would either turn your oven up a few degrees or let them bake just a little bit longer. Oh, great question, Con. Why do we have to soften and whip up our cream cheese when making cheesecake? Well, it's more your ease as you're baking, because if you're trying to add, when you make a cheesecake, you start by beating your cream cheese, then you add your sugar, and then you slowly add your eggs. If your cream cheese is hard to begin with, two things will happen. Your sugar won't dissolve into the cream cheese as easily, so you won't have a smooth cheesecake batter because it's going to have those tiny little granules of sugar in there. But also you'll find you're working harder to scrape the bowl and get a smooth cheesecake batter, because the minute you start adding liquid, whether it's the eggs or additional cream or sour cream, you're going to get lumps too easily. So those are two important reasons to make sure your cream cheese is at room temperature. Now, I've seen this question pop up a couple of times about using butter versus oil in cakes. So if you see a cake recipe call for butter, you can test it using oil. Recipes can vary, and I tend to use, I love butter for the flavor. I use oil for the moisture and when I want sort of a heavier cake. But typically, if you want to try substituting and go from butter to oil, you want to reduce the amount of oil by 20% according to what the butter calls for. And this goes back to my discussion of coconut oil. Oil is 100% fat. Butter is 80% or up to 84% fat. So you need to compensate by lowering your fat content and then replacing that 15 to 20% of liquid with additional liquid. If your recipe calls for lemon juice or milk or yogurt, add 15% more of that. And this is where, because all my recipes have weights, it's easier to figure out those percentages. So I hope that really helps. Oh, Zen is writing from Vienna, the home of delicious pastry. Oh my gosh, everything. I love all the beautiful torts. The strudel, the soccer tort in Vienna, absolutely amazing. And you may have missed my egg substitute. So if you either go back at the beginning for my longer explanation of my 2 favorite egg substitutes, but in a nutshell, 60 grams of silken tofu for every 1 egg when you want a smooth egg addition, like to set a custard style dessert. Or the flax egg is the easy one, a tablespoon of ground flaxseed to 3 tablespoons of warm water. Let it sit for a minute, and that's your 1 egg for simple things like muffins and cookies. Hello to everyone. And someone asked about cookbooks. I have at least 8 that are still in print right now. If you check out my website, and the link is right below, annaolson.ca, I do have a cookbook page with all my available cookbooks, including some in Spanish as well. My latest is called Baking Day. I have Bake with Anna Olson set for the holidays, and I think those are the big ones that are current. Oh, and Back to Baking, you'll find are currently available. Oh, and now we're getting into macaron territory. Fatima's asking, her mats can't dry and she can't ever seem to get a foot. Well, I'm not sure, Fatima, if you're using the French, the Italian, or the Swiss method, but I will say personally, you'll find that I did a live stream about a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago, where I demonstrated my Swiss method for macaron that is now currently my favorite method. And I find that it is less humidity and temperature sensitive in terms of drying. And I used to struggle with getting an even foot or a foot at all. And I find I have more luck with the Swiss method. So I hope you'll give that a try. Otherwise, I do have the French and the Italian method recipes right here on the channel. Oh, now here's an interesting question. Sean's asking, how can I achieve more cracks on your chocolate chip cookies? I would definitely say you want to chill your batter because that's going to set the butter within the batter, so that and put those cookies in the oven cold, because the outside of the cookie will start setting before the inside has had a chance to melt. And then as the inside melts and that butter and sugar liquefies, it's going to push that shell of the outside of the cookie out. And I think you'll develop more of those lovely crinkles and cracks that we all love absolutely so much. Oh, and thanks. Rob is moderating the live stream. So if you want to say hi to Rob, he's put the link to the Swiss macaron recipe right up on the chat thread here. And don't forget, if you have to sign off or you've just joined me right here, this whole live Q&A session will pop up on the channel just a few minutes after we stop broadcasting. Oh, I'm going to take a sip of lemonade, if you don't mind, because I think I have been talking a mile a minute, but your questions are so good. And as I drink lemonade, here comes a good question. I prefer to always use fresh lemon juice in my lemon forward recipes. If I'm making a lemon curd, a lemon meringue pie, lemon buttercream, I want to use real lemon juice because it is simply pure and freshly squeezed lemon juice. If you buy bottled, quite often it has an additive to preserve it. And sometimes, especially when it's heated, you can almost pick up a slight metallic taste. It's not bad, but if you're looking for lemon to be the star, then go for the fresh lemon juice. Where I don't mind using bottled lemon juice is, say, when I'm making my pie pastry and I'm adding 2 teaspoons of lemon juice for the function of the acidity. It's not really about the flavor. Then you can use the bottles. So I hope that answers your questions. We've got questions about sugar substitutes. Now, stevia can be used in baking. It's tricky though, because it has a concentrated sweetness. So you'll want to use a stevia product that has some bulk and that helps replace the volume that the sugar takes up in your recipe. But as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to pulling sugar out of a recipe, it also lends moisture. So you will want to increase your liquid if you're reducing sugar in your recipes. Oh, here's a good question about raisins and nuts burning on the top of your baking. And that can happen so often. So a great tip is if you're just making something simple like a muffin, soak your raisins and nuts for about 15 minutes in, it can be just, you can add flavor if you want to soak them in something like a little apple juice. But if you want to soak them in a little water, warm water, that will hydrate them a little bit so they're less likely to burn when they're on the top of, I hate that too. You get that one burnt raisin and it kind of forces itself out and you have to pick it out and throw it away. These questions are just flying in. Mariana's asking about replacing mascarpone cheese in making a tiramisu or tiramisu style dessert. And it's true, my last recipe up on the channel was a lemon tiramisu inspired dessert, a lemon strawberry tart. Cream cheese really is, or a fresh style of cream cheese is your best substitute there. If you can get a fromage frais, something in the queso fresco, even, dare I say, a really creamy ricotta cheese would work. But I would say a cream cheese is probably your best substitute. And it's a one-to-one substitute. You don't need to change anything else in the recipe. Substitutes for vanilla bean or vanilla bean paste. That's a good question. When it comes to adding accent flavor, where vanilla isn't the key ingredient, you can add a little bit of finely grated nutmeg or just a pinch of ground cinnamon, and that gives you sort of that back of the palate taste that is the function of vanilla. Vanilla kind of works like salt does in cooking. Vanilla does the same thing in baking. So you want to kind of add that back of the palate flavor. Like think lemon juice. When you taste something lemony, it's tart up front, but the lemon zest is in the back. Lemon zest is another option to add that sort of richness that pushes your other flavors forward. So you don't want it to taste like lemon, nutmeg, or cinnamon. That's why just a tiny bit will definitely help. Bilal is asking about coconut sugar, which is a fantastic replacement for granulated sugar in your baking. And I have tested a lot of my recipes using a 1-to-1 ratio. So if it calls for 200 grams of granulated sugar, use 200 grams of palm sugar and you'll be set. Okay, Samina's asking about making caramel that has a bitter taste to it. If you're using brown sugar, that may actually be contributing to the bitterness because it is less refined, depending on the type of your brown sugar. It is either less refined than white sugar or it has had molasses added back to it. So it's actually the molasses that's burning before the sugar has had a chance to caramelize. And molasses by nature has a bit of a bitter taste to it. So I think that may be your problem there. If you don't mind, try doing it with granulated sugar. And high heat is actually easier to work with because it gets that sugar up to, your sugar has to hit 310 Fahrenheit before it starts caramelizing. And so the faster it can do it, you'll build in that caramel flavor, but you don't want that slow burn. And the longer it takes to caramelize your sugar, the higher the risk of crystallization too, which means you have to go in and fix it and add water. These questions. My ace baker's here. Why are your croissants tasting yeasty, Ilianne? That could be simply they need a little more proof time, especially that final proof. After you've done the rolling and folding and in the fridge, your croissants slowly proof in the cold of the fridge. But once you've got them rolled and they're proofing right before they go in the oven, that's when that final push of the yeast happens. And you never want to rush that because two things will happen. You could get a yeasty flavor, but also the butter can also leach out because if the yeast has nowhere to go, the butter gets pushed out as your croissant bake. And I've had that happen a few times where my croissants stay small, they're flaky, but all the butter is in the bottom of my baking tray. And that's because I didn't let them proof long enough. Samreen is asking why donuts become dry. If they're yeast donuts, well, frankly, even if they're not yeasted donuts, it's just the nature of most things fried. They're best enjoyed freshly fried because either the oil gets heavy and a yeast dough, like even a bread dough, gets stale soon afterwards. So freshly made is definitely the way to go. And Bilal, yes, white rice flour is gluten-free. Check your labeling to make sure it's certified. Oh, and Peruvian Cookie is asking on laminating tips. Yes, and it's true that sometimes, especially in those initial rolls, if you're making puff pastry or croissant dough can even be trickier because it's a softer dough, you may find that your butter shatters a little bit as you roll it, and a little bit is allowable. And the key to success there is actually just to let your butter soften up a little bit. Not so much that it warms up, but then you'll find you'll get those smoother layers. And that depends on the temperature of where you live and the weather of the day. So if it means pulling your cold bourrage piece of butter from the fridge, maybe 20 minutes before you roll and pull out your détrempe, the base dough, and start folding, you may find it handles. Essentially, you want the butter to be the same consistency as the dough. So with puff pastry is a firmer dough, so the butter can be firmer. Croissant dough, at its base is a little softer, so your butter can be a little softer. So that is a very good question. And then in terms of a vegan version for puff pastry, you can use vegan butter options. Coconut oil is not the best option because coconut oil, when refrigerated, turns rock hard and becomes very difficult to work with. So I would go with your preferred vegan butter replacement product. Again, watch the salt content though. We're getting lots of substitution questions. And oh, Cherry, hi Cherry, it's great to see you. How to keep a pastry with laminated oil, dough and water dough from separating. That is trickier. It takes a little time, but the nature of those doughs is the oil does pull away because you're dealing with a liquid fat as opposed to a solid fat. If there's anything I could recommend is, can you chill the oil? Would that help? I'd be interested to know what that dough is just so I could better address it. Oh, great. A question about agar powder versus gelatin. The difference between the two in taste is negligible. Both are neutral tasting. In terms of the set, they are a little bit different. There's a bit of a springiness to agar where gelatin sort of jiggles. Agar's got a bit of a bounce, but ultimately you will achieve the same results if you're using agar, or gelatin powder in equal measurements. So the choice is yours, one over another as a substitute. The key is how and when you add it. So agar powder to fully activate has to come to a full simmer. So if you're making something like a mousse that needs gelatin or agar to set, you add that to the liquid and you make sure it comes up to a full simmer. Gelatin, you bloom in liquid, cold liquid, and then you don't want to boil it. You pull your warm liquid off the heat, you add it, and you just stir it in to dissolve. So these are fantastic questions. Oh, Vina's asking about frosting a cake. Vina's got trouble. Once you get to the top edge of the cake starts to show through. What you can do when frosting a cake is give it a crumb coat first. So you assemble your layers one at a time. You put a dollop of frosting in the center and you push it towards the outside edge. Then you stack your layers on top. And then I always start by frosting the top with a generous dollop of frosting, more than you'll need. It's easier to pull away frosting than it is to add more. So a big dollop right on top, start leveling it, pushing it over that top edge. Then when you're frosting your sides, it's easier to get your frosting from the side to meet that overhang at the top. You'll get a nice crisp, sharp edge. It'll be very, very even and easier to then spread and level. And I think you'll find you'll have fewer bare spots that poke through because you've already got more frosting. And if you've got too much frosting, then you can just peel away a little at a time until you're happy. The butter and oil topic. is coming up again. My preference, it really depends on the recipe. I have cakes that use both, and quite often an oil-based cake will be rich and moist, but sometimes you want a slightly buttery, fluffier, lighter cake. The butter versus oil debate won't affect the tenderness of the cake. It will change the flavor a little bit. Oil cakes also have a tendency to stay fresh longer. I will be honest about that, as much as I love my butter. Uh, oh, Rabia, the main substitute for almond flour in making macaron. That is something I would have to play with, because if it's a nut allergy, that's a tough one. Macaron, part of the beauty of macaron is their simplicity. Almond flour, sugar, egg whites, boom. So the minute you start getting into other nut flours, you're dealing with different fat contents. And then if you're dealing with other ingredients, you won't get that beautiful combination. It really takes its own recipe, of which sadly I don't have, but I'm going to take that challenge. So give me a little time and I'll work on that. Oh, Ira, this is a good question. How do we get that shiny, crackly top on brownies easily each and every time? I find that has a lot to do with the temperature of the melted chocolate and butter. The very first step when you're making your brownies, I used to let my melted chocolate and butter cool a bit, and then I would add my sugar, and then I would add my eggs, and then a little bit of flour and bake the brownies. And I didn't often get a crackly top. I find working with that chocolate right away, warm off the heat, adding the sugar, getting those eggs in there and getting it into the oven, that temperature really helps to develop that nice, shiny, crackly layer that we love on top of our brownies. And that has been just a lot of practice and repetition over time that's helped me figure that out. A question about tapping. Oh, hi, Amit. Tapping your cake batter before putting in the oven. If you've used electric beaters or a stand mixer to make your cake, probably in the process or even scooping the batter into your pans, there will be a few air pockets in there. So what you need, this is why the recipe calls for tapping your pans, just to knock out any big air bubbles. Don't do this with a sponge cake. Only with a butter-based cake do you need to worry about that. But I find these days when I use the reverse method, which you see me do with a lot of my cakes, so I start with my flour and sugar and baking powder in the mixing bowl. Then I cut in my room temperature butter. Then I add my eggs and liquids all at once, which is a far easier method. Fewer dishes and less fuss, none of this alternating dry and wet nonsense. I don't get the big air bubbles like I used to when I did the alternating. So I think by switching the method, we've also saved ourselves a step. So I don't always remember to tap my pans, but it's a good habit. It's a very good habit. Colleen, well, thanks for watching in the early days. I've been on the Food Network, or depending on where you're watching, if you're watching from Asian Food Network or Food Network around the world, I've been on for quite some time. But it's such a treat for me to be able to come on live and speak to you today. As you can tell, it's allergy season, so that's why I'm a little hoarse right now. But I got the lemonade going on. We've got a question. Why does carrot cake spill out of the pan? It could be your pan is just a touch too small. And carrot cake can rise up a lot. Sometimes carrot cake batter tends to be very, very wet. So it's got lots of lifting to do, and it rises up quite levelly, where some cakes get a dome to them, which we try and not have happen. But I would try a slit, just even if it's only a centimeter bigger pan, that might help you out there. Oh, here's a good question, Justin. What is the difference between a scone and a biscuit? Geography does factor in a fair bit. A scone or a scone is traditionally from the UK, and is a combination of butter, and it can have an egg added to it or usually milk, and it's blended together, pressed flat. It's not a terribly wet dough. And then you can use a cookie cutter, you can go for the wedge shaped, and that's based. Where a biscuit is known as typically being more American, quite often has buttermilk added to it because that is an ingredient that's more popular in North America than in other parts of the world. There are multiple styles of biscuits. Some can have lots of butter added to them. Some can actually be quite lean, or the drop style. I have a drop style biscuit right here on the channel, and it's so soft, you just mix it in the bowl and scoop it. And it bakes up a little more fluffy, and quite often not with a lot of sugar to it. So either a biscuit can be served with savory dishes, or it's great slathered with butter and a dollop of jam. A scone, of course, a little bit of clotted cream and jam goes a long way. And speaking of daydreamer, what's my favorite dessert? It depends on my mood. So right now, I am obsessing over apricots. Apricots are in season. They've just come into season here in the south of France. I have to say, I think they are my favorite fruit as a baker. I love their size. I love how you can kind of add them to any recipe. And because they don't let out a lot of liquid, they hold their shape and they improve. They're better when they're cooked than they are fresh and raw. And they have such a short season. So I get so excited about apricots. Why don't you tell me on the thread quickly? I know it'll throw the thread off. And I'm going to talk about splitting frosting because I saw that. But why don't you tell me your favorite fruit to bake with? Because I do love fruit desserts. They are my absolute favorite. And while you're telling me your favorite fruit to bake with, I'll handle that question because I think it came from a warm weather climate about a splitting frosting, which can be, interestingly, depending on the type of frosting. If you're doing an American buttercream, the splitting can happen because the butter itself gets too warm. So if you're in a warm climate, let it be. Hello, rhubarb. Love rhubarb. If you're in a warmer climate, then whip your butter when you're making an American buttercream a little bit cooler. Strangely, a Swiss buttercream, after you've made your meringue and then you're hitting it with the butter, if it starts to separate, it can actually be a sign that it cooled down too much. In which case, your fix is to keep whipping it on high speed, and the friction of your mixer will warm up the frosting and eventually it will come together. Or you might have seen this, you can take a little hair dryer or air gun and just warm the outside of the bowl or put it over a water bath just for like a second or two. And that can warm the butter, the split buttercream, and bring it back because you're adding fat to egg whites that have been already cooked. And so you want that unlike ingredient to blend in smoothly. So, we've got a question of who here likes durian or doesn't like durian. If you're from Southeast Asia or Asia, some people absolutely love it. Some people absolutely don't. Doesn't seem to be sitting on the fence when it comes to durian. If you've never tried it before, it is hard to describe, but it's all about the aroma. And we've got lots of berries that came in, and citrus and apples in the dessert category. And you know what? I love them all when they're in their peak season. Right now, where I live and here, apples aren't in season. So I'm not really interested in apples right now. I want to embrace all the summer fruits, but the minute it becomes September and fresh in-season apples become available, I'm going to jump right in. Here's another good question. Ira's asking, what are my thoughts on brown butter for recipes? Brown butter is delicious by nature. It has been, the butter itself, the milk solids have been toasted, so it lends a nutty flavor. They can add a depth of flavor to your recipes. The difference is you've got to find a recipe to use it in. You can't just throw it into a recipe that calls for softened regular butter. Because once it's been cooked and then cooled again, it's changed in its texture. And you know, if you melt butter and chill it again, how it becomes gritty, it won't combine the same way as just softened butter will. You can give it a good whip if you need to, but this is where it suits being used in a recipe that calls for melted butter. And that's where it works in more easily. Ahmed is asking a great question. Do I have any safer option to make dulce de leche? Which the typical way you see it made is to actually boil a tin of condensed milk in a pot of water for 2 to 3 hours. 2 if you want a sauce, 3 if you want a spread. You have to make sure that you cannot leave it unattended. You have to make sure there's always at least a couple inches of water over the top of the tin before it boils. Plus, it takes a long time. You can do it stovetop, Ahmed. So open the tin, put it in the stove, except you will be prepared to be in front of the stove for a while. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes. You don't want to cook it on high heat because the bottom will scorch, but you can cook your condensed milk in about 20 minutes on medium-low heat, stirring constantly, and it will caramelize. So while it is a little more work, it will take you less time, and certainly then you don't have to watch a pot for 3 hours. Oh, great question, Priya. I would love to explore India for its cuisine and its desserts. I'm actually doing a little more research, and you will be seeing some more international recipes right here on this channel because I am traveling again. I'm here in the south of France on holiday right now, but I've been traveling and Michael and I have been taping as we go, and I have been inspired to make some pretty amazing recipes. So keep an eye on this channel because you're going to see that coming out later this summer. Oh, here's a good question about coconut milk as a creme brulee substitute in place of cream. I think that would make a fantastic substitute. You will taste the coconut, but in terms of consistency, it would be divine. Oh, Cherry would like samosas, please. I actually have a samosa recipe. I should dig that up and just do a live stream. Maybe we should do some live streams on savory baking, savory recipes. That would be a good idea. Do you agree? Let me know what you think. Oh, and Caro Tech, what is the best s'mores recipe? I have a wicked s'mores recipe right here on the O Yum channel. I turned the s'mores into a giant 3-tiered wedding cake. So don't let that daunt you. The actual recipe that's beneath it is for a simple 9-inch square pan. And what I like to do is make the s'mores. I layer them in the pan, bake them. So and I make this sort of gooey paste with the graham crackers. And you can spoon it out of the dish warm, or you can even chill them, cut them into squares. And personally, I like them cold, or you can rewarm them. So then you can make them at your convenience if you're not doing the whole campfire s'more thing. Here, interesting. Bethlehem and greetings to you in Ethiopia. Your cake is hardening on the surface. Baking soda is likely not the problem. I do find sometimes that your chocolate can really affect the consistency of your cake batter. So depending on the percentage of cocoa mass in your chocolate, you could be if you're using a high percentage, it might actually be too strong for your cake because the lower percentage means you're going to have more room for cocoa butter and milk solids. It'll be softer, and that will make a softer cake. So maybe try changing your chocolate, but stick with the recipe and see if that does anything. Renee's asking if butter is necessary in a ganache. It depends on the recipe, Renee. If you're doing bonbons, you'll want butter in there for that silky taste, but you can make truffles or bonbons or use a ganache without the butter. What you want to do is cool it down and then give it a little whisk before you chill it to add a little volume before you put it in the fridge, and that'll help it. And then you don't need any butter added afterwards. Oh, Kimberly has got some high altitude baking issues. Yes, and Yorkshire puddings, which rely on their lift to set, can definitely be at 1,400 meters. You definitely have some. I'm trying to think with the Yorkshire pudding what to do. Your eggs, in a nutshell, high altitude baking relies, what you're dealing with is lower air pressure, so low resistance. So things rise up faster, and a recipe designed for sea level sets at sea level, but at a lower air pressure, it rises up, but it's not setting, so then it collapses. So I would suggest perhaps in, instead of one of your whole eggs in your Yorkshire pudding, replace that instead with 2 egg whites, because the egg white has more protein and it sets at a lower temperature. That might help give you the structure and lift that is all you need to get that set. And I know Yorkshire puddings that are baked at a higher temperature, but baking at a higher temperature is also kind of one of the additional tips in high altitude baking. But I would try the 2 egg whites in place of one whole egg in your recipe and try that first. Um, oh, Bilal's asking about gluten-free chocolate chip cookies to make them chewier. You know what it's going to take, Bilal? And we've been talking about sugar substitutes, but you need to add almost a liquid sugar, like a corn syrup, to get them kind of chewy in the center, because you've got that combination of ingredients where gluten-free flours, they tend to make things a little more crumbly. That's a tougher one. Um, Sylvia, oh, Sylvia's just, I love that you're weighing in on the flavors. Blueberries are such a good one. I have tons of blueberry recipes here. And you can take a recipe that calls for raspberries, or other berries, and often replace them, or blackberries, and replace them with blueberries. Uh, Ahmad is asking about coating cookies, or anything for that matter. Is it better to use compound or tempered couverture chocolate? Well, there are a number of factors that come into play, Ahmed. One is cost. Compound chocolate is far more affordable than couverture chocolate. Compound chocolate just has to be melted. It has more emulsifiers in it, typically soy lecithin, less chocolate, pure chocolate in it. Will sometimes have chocolate flavor. So it's just simply easy to work with. You can melt it in the microwave and then simply work with it, and it sets up on its own. Couverture chocolate takes the tempering process, and you'll find I have a live stream right here on how to temper chocolate to walk you through the step by step. And you want to do that because couverture chocolate, once melted, will not set up on its own at room temperature. And if you refrigerate it without going through the tempering process, you'll get streak marks, sort of waves through it. So it's a matter of choice. I don't want to say one over the other. I'll leave that decision up to you. One is more work, delicious, slightly more expensive. The other's easy and affordable. And Cherry, does couverture have to be refrigerated? Well, it depends on the climate outside. When you're storing your regular baking chocolate, try and avoid storing it in the fridge. If you can keep it in a cool, dark place, that's the best. What couverture chocolate doesn't like is temperature changes. Cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot. You will find if it goes through that you'll get a fat bloom on the outside of your sugar, and it'll look like a white, dusty coating. That is not mold. There's nothing wrong with the chocolate. It just means it did go through that temperature shift. And so the cocoa butter has actually risen to the surface of the chocolate. You can remelt it and use it again. But try and avoid storing your baking chocolate in the fridge or freezer if you can. But Cherry, I know you're in the Philippines and it's a bit warm, so maybe you have to. Here's a good question. What is a good replacement for cake and pastry flour in angel food cake, or cakes that call for it? So if you don't want to go out and buy cake and pastry flour, what you want to do is take your all-purpose or plain flour, and for every 1 cup or 150 grams, measure out 2 tablespoons and replace that with 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. That lowers the protein content of the flour. You've got the fine texture of the cornstarch, which mimics that finer grind of the cake and pastry flour, and you'll find you get a suitable result. Oh, and Kevin Jung from Malaysia, hello. One of my fellow pastry chefs from here in Canada. I've been following her. Love Soirette is in Malaysia right now, and I just love seeing the desserts. She's obsessing over all the desserts. Oh, she just posted about onde onde and quail lapis the other day. But you're asking, oh, now I forgot what you were asking about. I got distracted. I'm going to have to sign off pretty soon. I can't believe an hour has flown by. Oh, but I will handle Ilianne's question, and then I will take one more question. But this was obviously such a hit that I will come back and definitely do these again, because I just love talking to you. I get such great inspiration. But Ilianne was asking about, she uses the reverse method for her cakes, and they're coming out overmixed. That is a very good puzzle. And I'm not sure why, because you do have to give them a good mix after you add the liquids. Make sure you're cutting in that fat really, really well. That protects your flour. And then when you add your liquids, you have to mix it on low speed, and then you have to give it a little bit of volume, which is why you typically increase the speed and you let it go for about 90 seconds or 2 minutes. Maybe you've got a really powerful mixer. Maybe try just mixing it for a minute or even 30 seconds until you get that smooth, creamy look, and see if that helps, because there's really not much else that can be done. So I hope that helps. Okay, so Patsy, you're going to be my last question. How to make meringue cookies that stay crisp and not sweaty. Living in a tropical country, that is a tricky one. Definitely the low temperature oven. You need the sugar. What I would recommend is you can buy the silicone packs that get packed with electronic goods. Don't put that in your baking, but store your meringues in an airtight container with a couple of those silicone packets in them. Don't let them touch the food, but they will wick away the moisture to help your meringue stay nice and crispy. So I hope that helps. Make sure before you put your meringues in the oven that oven is preheated to really dry it out, so you have no ambient humidity in there. And if the recipe calls for cracking the oven door, don't crack the oven door, because that's just going to let in humidity. So I hope that helps. Oh, you know what? I'm going to take one more question from Kate. Or are you asking Rob that question? What is his favorite fruit and herb combination in baking? Would you like to weigh in, Rob, on that? Because I think we know mine right now is apricots, and I notice my signal is also fading away. So I think it is actually time to sign off. But I'll be back with another live stream. Look for new recipes, exciting travel-based ones, and I will see you soon. Thank you all. You're amazing bakers. You're amazing fans, and I love talking to you. Have a great day.